Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. My name is Nick Milley. I'm the map curator here at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event this evening on behalf of myself and my co-convener, Elizabeth Baigent, who you'll be seeing later. So, welcome to the virtual map room of the Bodleian Library. Before we start, I'd just like to make some announcements of some other events of a cartographic nature. Our sister series, Maps and Society, which is hosted by the Warburg Institute and the University of London, their next event is on not until the 27th of February, so we'll have another meeting before then. On the 27th of February, Louise McCarthy and Ladan Nayash of Università Paris Cité will be talking about cartographic science at the service of company propaganda in early imperialist Britain, 1600 to 1625. This event is a hybrid event, so you can attend online or go and attend live. Our colleagues in Cambridge, their next Cambridge Map Seminar is 2 days before that, actually, on the 25th of February, when Finian O'Connor of Dublin will be speaking about a peculiar survey for our peculiar purpose, founding the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. Now then, in terms of our events here in Oxford, we have another Tosca seminar in a fortnight's time when we'll be welcoming Margriet Hoogvliet and Anouk de Vries from the University of Amsterdam. And they will be discussing decolonizing cartographic heritage, theory, maps, and Dutch Brazil. And after that event, we don't have anything until I think it's May. So there'll be a little while, and then we'll have a number of seminars towards the end of the academic year. But this afternoon, it's a real pleasure to run our annual map reading session. Now, for those of you who haven't attended a map reading session before, this is a little different in that Liz will be discussing a new book with, and we have two speakers tonight, Tania Rossetto and Laura Presti from the University of Padua in Italy. And before we get on to Laura and Tania, just to give you a bit of flavour about our map reading series, we have run 4 of these previously, and they've all been remarkably successful. We began in 2019 with Matthew Edney was our guest, and he gave a provocative and stimulating session on cartography, the ideal and its history. This was followed up by Karen Vegan and Caroline Winter's Time in Maps from 2020. Then we had Mirela Altish, Encounters in the New World on Jesuit cartography. And our most recent map readings, we welcomed Isabella Alexander from Australia, who was talking about copyright and cartography, history, law, and the circulation of geographic knowledge. So tonight, it's a real pleasure to consider the Routledge Handbook of Cartographic Humanities, which was published last year in 2024, so it's pretty new. And we have with us the book's co-editors. So Tania Rossetto and Laura Lopresti, and Liz will be here representing the University of Oxford. There is Liz. So if Laura and Tania, you can switch on your cameras and demute, and I will leave it to Liz to take over and hope everybody has an enjoyable evening. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here with our co-authors this evening to discuss this excellent book, which I can thoroughly recommend, but it's perhaps a little bit dense, and some people may be unfamiliar with some of the terms in it. So it's a pleasure to be able to unpick some of the content this evening with Tania and Laura. Thank you so much for coming. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, just to introduce yourselves and tell us something of your intellectual backgrounds, excuse me, and your present posts.
Yes, I'm starting. Hi everyone. First of all, thanks to the organizers for this kind invitation to take part in Tosca. I am a cultural geographer and I work as an associate professor at the University of Padova in the Department of Historical and Geographic Sciences and the Ancient World, where I also serve as deputy dean. I teach cultural geography, social geography, and visual cultures of urban landscapes. My areas of expertise are visual geography, with a particular interest in photography, geographic epistemologies, of course, cultural cartography, urban studies, and mobility humanities. So my approach to cartography is strongly influenced by my humanistic, theoretical, and visual geographic background.
Yeah, so for my part, hello, Elizabeth and Nick. A huge thank you from my side as well for this kind invitation. I'm also a cultural geographer at the University of Padua, where I work in the same department as Tania. I teach human geography as well as creative and critical approaches to map mobilities. My research draws on influences from visual studies, contemporary art, critical theory, bridging geography and cartography with a particular focus on visual representations of mobilities, especially related to migration. While in terms of historical cartography, I have a particular interest in the role of popular cartography, everyday mapping, and also propaganda cartography in shaping colonial imaginaries, particularly within the context of the Italian fascist empire. My approach to cartography has been anyway deeply influenced by cultural studies and the new cultural geography, I would say.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That allows us to set things in context. And can I, before we get to the book in particular, can I ask each of you how you became interested in maps in general?
Well, I approach the cartographic studies coming from geography, visual culture, and media studies, and in particular by delving into image and photography theory literature. I began to believe that cartography was too confined within narrow theoretical horizons, such as the Arraean critical cartography that emerged in the 90s. And therefore, I started to think of maps as images among other images. And this led me to try to expand the ways of thinking about maps, the methodologies for researching them, and the repertoires to consider in empirical research. Meanwhile, the emergence of the so-called post-representational paradigm in the mid-2000s greatly influenced this attempt to broaden the horizons of cultural cartographic research. And so I began, for example, to conduct ethnographic research on cartographic practices using creative techniques such as the carto essay to present these studies. I worked on embodying tourist maps or on the relationship between maps and literature, on the visual association of maps and ethnic racial otherness, or more recently on the objecthood of maps, just to mention a few things.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, well, my interest in maps is also a bit eclectic. It began during an internship at a contemporary art museum, while I was also taking a geography course during my bachelor's program in the humanities. And at that time, my professor of geography argued that cartography was dead for geographers. It was just a tool of power or a very limited representational image. However, my work curating exhibitions told a different story. I discovered the maps, far beyond this modern scientific ideal, were powerful tools for artists to convey information, express emotions, critique various injustices. And I recognized their expressive potential, and I shared the same discomfort that Tania expressed about these overtly restrictive critiques of maps that were somehow devouring geography. This interest then deepened during my PhD when I decided to explore the role of cartography in contemporary geography. So I focused on how maps and mapping practices had been retheorized over the past 30 years, considering key shifts in this discipline, such as the cultural turn, the post-representational turn, the visual and the material turn. And these developments contributed to this definition of what maps can do as images and how they can be understood as processes, practices, and performances. So for me, the most compelling aspects of maps is their ability somehow to move us in many ways. I approach maps as a prism where I can explore the cultural, the affective, but also the political construction of space across various contexts. These include migration studies, everyday nationalism, colonial cartographies, as I said before, but also extend into diverse fields such as gender studies, game studies, arts, and the environmental humanities.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Well, I'm sure we're all grateful you didn't take any notice of your professor, but went on to write this stimulating book for us. So let's turn to your book now, if we may. And I believe you've got some slides to share as we guide our conversation. So first of all, it's the Handbook of Cartographic Humanities, and I wonder if you could actually define cartographic humanities for our audience. Obviously, people who come to Tosca seminars are all familiar with maps, but maybe the term cartographic humanities is a new one.
Yes, okay, I'll go with this. Well, to answer these questions, we might turn to the words of Ifutwan, a humanistic geographer who, in a 1972 interview at the University of Minnesota, explained his understanding of humanistic geography this way. He distinguished it from human geography by saying that humanistic geography places an explicit recognition of and an ultimate interest in the human condition, and thus takes a general interest in all the humanities. So, in a similar vein, cartographic humanities ask, what does it happen when cartography becomes the object of inquiry of the arts and the humanities? What does it mean for a map to engage with the human condition, and even for us as map scholars to engage with the humanness, with the human condition of a map, with the entire range of the human experiences, emotions, memories, conflicts, desires, life stories, social histories that are part of this world? But we may also extend these questions to consider even the post-human condition of the map, especially in the digital era. We choose this term also to draw a parallel with the geo-humanities, an umbrella term that encompasses the growing interdisciplinary engagement between geography and arts and the humanities. Our aim was somehow to emphasize the increasing involvement of the arts and the humanities in map thinking and map research. This emerging field naturally intersects with the more established traditions, such as the history of cartography, but also critical cartography, while encompassing a wide range of works and perspectives, and spanning also from a kind of affirmative, joyful appreciation of maps to their critical deconstruction. So within this expressive terrain, the aim is to demonstrate not only how, let's say, cartography increasingly permeates humanistic disciplines, but also how these encounters have profoundly transformed the cartographic theory and practice. Indeed, while map scholars have long contributed to humanistic fields, offering innovative theoretical frameworks, methodological tools, and empirical data, there is also a growing recognition that works from other disciplines offer valuable insights for cartographers. This reciprocity, I would say that is not one-sided. Works from fields such as cultural studies, art history, archaeology, or even cinema and literary studies can challenge and enrich the theoretical and empirical foundations of cartography, suggesting new ways to approach and understand maps. This dialogical exchange invites map scholars to reconsider their methods, expand their disciplinary boundaries, and engage more deeply with broader sociocultural implications of mapping practices. So when inviting our contributors and assembling the handbook, we considered whether each unique connection that currently links cartography with a single humanistic field, such as, I don't know, cartography and history, cartography and philosophy, could be reframed within such a broader theoretical and practical space, the cartographic humanities. Then also the cover of our book is quite telling. It features an artwork by Fabio Runcato from his series Beneath the Lines, and this series was inspired by his art residency at the Museum of Geography of the University of Padova within the Map Party project, which was curated by Giada Peterle, who also contributed a chapter to this handbook, and Giovanni Donadelli. What he did, he engaged with old topographical maps from the Istituto Geografico Militare, which is the official Italian government agency responsible for cartographic activities in Italy. And Roncato's work involves creatively repurposing these maps into sculptures, blending clay, loam, chalk, and by literally placing his hands into the map and then casting them in clay, his sculptures remind us of this kind of extractivist, even political, colonial impulse of cartography, but also this kind of physical, visceral engagement with the world, the mapping, of course, as. The cover image, then, if you see on the background, also includes this 19th century globe, a modern planisphere, but also rare books in the museum's Sala della Musica, the music hall, symbolizing this call for a kind of open, pluralistic approach to map research that bridges traditional and innovative perspectives and past, of course, and present sources. So multiple theoretical perspectives of maps and mapping exist, each offering distinct ways of understanding then maps and their role in society. So this is in many ways what the cartographic humanities are all about. We are not merely analyzing maps from a distance, not merely critiquing the cartographic reason. We are actively engaging with them, touching, feeling, interpreting, transforming them in ways that reflect various experiences of the world. So the challenge of the cartographic humanities lies, I would say, in fostering this more constructive engagement with the ubiquity of maps, charting different horizons for critical inquiry and practical interventions, while also maintaining, of course, the rigorous critiques that have shaped the field since now.
Thank you. And it's a very intriguing cover. Thank you for telling us about that. That's really very interesting indeed. So I wonder why you felt the handbook was needed, and maybe particularly needed at this moment.
Well, to tell the truth, this book was initially suggested by my reference editor at Routledge, Fair Lering, and I find this very significant as a testament to the need for a book that addressed the cartographic studies from a very broad cultural perspective. And after we worked together on my book about maps as objects, she wrote me, and I'm quoting because I think it's really interesting regarding the need for this book. So Faye wrote me, in recent years, I have noticed interesting projects in cartography, creative cartography, deep mapping, embodiment, visual studies, and work which looks at the mapping of real and imagined spaces from literature, film, and other media. I have been thinking about whether there is scope for a new handbook that captures this research. The book would be theoretical or conceptual in nature rather than a practical guide. So my feeling is that this editor had indeed well detected the growth of this varied field of study. And indeed, at that time, Routledge had just published the Handbook of Mapping and Cartography, edited by Alexander Kent and Peter Bujakovic. Yet, our handbook was perceived as something very different, because the previous handbook featured humanistic understandings of maps as somehow ancillary to the core cartographic content. Our proposal was also different from Stanley Dunn and Martin Dodge's Springer 2017 collection on mapping across academia, because it didn't propose the relationship between cartography and specific fields as mapping across academia does, that is cartography and literature, cartography and art, cartography and religion, cartography and ecology, and so on. Indeed, other books, as the ones you see in the slide on literature and art, do this by focusing just one disciplinary domain. Our handbook works in a different manner by building an interdisciplinary space of encounter between disciplines around common axes of interest, foundational nodes, some shared instances, recurring interrogations, and also present urgencies. Moreover, in our view, the fact that this collection was conceived more than a decade after collections such as Rethinking Maps or The Map Reader, edited by Martin Dodge, Rob Kitchin, and Chris Perkins, was a way to trace the expansion of the field after these seminal contributions. And when I say the field, I mean the field of study that Dodge, Kitchin, and Perkins suggest calling map studies, a highly transdisciplinary field essentially characterized by a cultural vein. So, in sum, our goal with this volume is not to establish a new field of study, but to legitimize and give visibility to existing research that has emerged and is now expanding in various disciplinary but also geographical contexts.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So maybe we'll take a deeper dive into the text itself now, if we may. So you've divided your book into 7 parts. So if we take each of those in turn, I'll ask you perhaps to describe its approach briefly. So the first part, you consider what you describe as the humans maps relation, and you introduce the idea of the post-human. Again, perhaps you could just elaborate on that term post-human and the whole of that first section for our audience. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, of course. So the handbook opens with the section titled Preludes and Trends, which includes both foundational and cutting-edge theoretical interventions. Here, Veronica Della Dora offers a crucial opening to this handbook with her chapter titled Mapping Inner Worlds, Cartography as a Humanity, which develops the chronological as well as existential depth of the relationship between humans and maps, showing how maps have been somehow anthropologically implicated in inner human worlds throughout history, and the metaphor of deep mapping on which Les Roberts reflects is quite telling here. While bringing together humans, maps, relations of the past, the present, and the future, then, is facilitated by a post-representational, processual, relational appreciation of cartography as always mappings, which clearly emerges from Matthew Edeney's chapter, and which we should say underlines the handbook as a whole. The chapter on chorography as opposed to cartography is telling here, since it reveals the hermeneutical potential of both ancient and contemporary conceptions of chorography in relation to human experience, reviving its language, the language of chorography in a time of spatial digital humanities. Well, this first section revolves around the humans maps relation by taking into account individual inner existential worlds, but also social ones, through an ethical interrogation of cartography, and particularly of collective, socially engaged mapping experiences, which are massively expanding worldwide, as the recent London RGS conference on mappings has widely demonstrated. Actually, the majority of the papers presented were on collaborative, activist counter-mapping practices. This is a pervasive trend indeed. And as shown in the chapter by Orangutango Collective, from the humanistic attitude of self-reflexivity comes the need for stepping back to a truly engaged cartographic collaborative practice that is really able to cultivate deeper caring relationships. Paradoxically, a similar ethical preoccupation in no less human ways emerges from Joe Gerlach's chapter on post-human cartography. And despite its being anthropocentric by nature as human too, cartography is here considered in its capacity to decenter the human and to generate attentiveness to the non-human world. For Gerlach, cartography is post-human when it is transfigured into a kind of reparative, therapeutic and caring gesture towards the earth. Well, of course, there are other ways of considering maps in a more than human vein, as non-human subjects with a life of their own, as I do in my monograph on maps as things, and as Giada Peterle does in her chapter in the Handbook, where she considers the map as a self-speaking I. But we could also mention Martin Bruckner's chapter on the social lives of maps intended as non-human actors in relation to human ones.
Thank you. And then moving on, we get to the second part when you consider ancient historical and literary sources and the materialities and textures of these texts. I wonder if you could comment on that, and perhaps in particular to the animal perspectives that you mentioned, since these will be, I think, new to many people in the audience tonight.
Yes, the second section draws from the centrality of textuality within the fabric of the humanities. As you said, the contributors of this section pay great attention to the materialities embedded in texts, as well as in the processes of writing, reading, and interpreting texts. The chapters take in consideration ancient archaeological, historical, or literary sources, and a common humanistic trait is the fact of lingering on texts and their cartographic inflections through acts of close reading, comparison, reflection, held in the library, the archive, or the archaeological site. So lingering on maps, a slow attunement to maps, as Zeman suggests in his chapter, is quintessential to sense their materialities, trace their histories, and listen to their stories in a humanistic vein. While lingering on cartographically inflected documents, the contributors pay attention also to the internal and external connections these documents activate with multiple contexts, thus seeing maps as always mapping entanglements. For Salvatore, this can be found in the interplay of text, diagrams, memory, and travel in late antique cartography. For Piraye, in the material effects of archaeological mapping. For Tiago, in the contextualization of the use of movement maps among historians. And for Julien, in the way in which actual cartographic documents are used, read, and annotated by writers in connection with the reality inhabited by the writers, but also by the readers. As for the animal perspective, well, I remember that after reading Sally Bushell's chapter for the first time, we asked her to emphasize the focus on the animal perspective because we find it particularly powerful and in line with recent debates on new materialism, multi-speciesism, eco-criticism. Essentially, Sally works on maps included in fictional literary texts in which animals, like rabbits or otters, are the protagonists. And such maps, such cartographic literary paratexts, reveal the contradiction between the human and the animal point of view on space, and they reveal the unrepresentability in human language of other than human spatial consciousness. Yet in the dynamics of the narration, in the narrative world, such contradictory maps nonetheless produce the effect of decentering the human perspective in favor of a biocentric one, thus finally expressing a kind of animal advocacy. So we really appreciated zoocentric mapping as an additional form of posthuman cartography.
Thank you. That's intriguing. On to the third part now. You address what you describe as cartographic mediality. And again, I think it would help the audience if you define that as well as in relations with other media.
Yeah, this section is centered on one of the most extensive areas of exchange between map studies and the humanities, one which considers maps and mappings from a media perspective. Now, if on the basis of their communicative functions, maps have been thought of as media for a long time, it is only recently that the complexity of media theory and media studies have come to connect with map studies. And this process has led to a growing interest not only in the medialities of maps, but also in the interrelations between them and other kinds of media. And the chapters included in this section oscillate between these two poles. One, providing theoretical insight into cartographic mediality, and two, providing studies about the intermediate relations between maps and other media. The section includes interventions on the more established binomial of cartography and cinema, but also less common areas of research that play somehow on the borders of cartography. My chapter, for instance, I work with music videos that morph into maps, and I do cartographic theory with music videos as a kind of meta maps. Davide Papotti then works with maps in print advertisements, and I find it particularly interesting that he says he looks at cartography in its free leisure time when cartography is not doing its regular work. Roger Paes and colleagues use cartography to mediate design. Here, maps and mappings are thought of as projective media. They can mediate the potentialities of urban sites, inform urban visions, and test potential realities. Well, both Giorgio Avezzua and Christel Luckenbiel consider cinema, but in very different ways. Giorgio works on the mapping of data that show territorial differences in audiovisual consumption and regional taste cultures, while Chris argues for an antithetical cartography or geospatial cinema, and that merges the scopy regimes and technologies of perspectivalism from one side and projectionalism on the other. So he interestingly remobilizes some of the paradoxical features of cartography and chorography and proposes a remaking of the map-view dichotomy within digital geospatial environments. Tommaso instead enriches this section with a purely philosophical reading of cartography from a media anthropological perspective, stating that cartography is a necessary mediation and a necessary matrix of human imagination.
Thank you. That's extremely thought-provoking. Moving on, because we've got to keep up to speed. There's a huge amount in the book, and we need to give our audience a flavour of each part. So you move on to think about the digital experience and the part you see maps playing in that. So could you tell us something about that?
Yes, I'll answer this and let Tania rest a bit. Well, if you think about that, when digital cartography is linked to the humanities, the association is most frequently considered through references to literary GIS, historical GIS, the application of Esri, GIS story maps in humanistic endeavors, and so on. As this fourth part shows, our delineation of the cartographic humanities includes digital culture, but it is not limited to this tech-oriented use of cartography within the digital humanities. In this section, our aim is to highlight actually the maps in the digital age don't just serve as tools for navigation or data representation. They are not simply that. They become cultural phenomena that intertwine human subjectivities with non-human entities within a larger hybrid ecology. So one key aspect of these digital maps is the way they transform our relationship to space and even to ourselves. Claire Redelman, for instance, interprets the blue dot on smartphone maps as this narcissistic projection of the self onto the map. So this seemingly simple feature represents a broader trend in which digital maps become vehicles for self-representation, forms of ego mappings, revealing the individualization and solipsism of our special existence. Moreover, as Sam points out, digital navigation is increasingly characterized by automation, where machine-driven processes shape our experiences. However, this automation doesn't merely dehumanize the act of navigating. It incorporates human labor and decision-making in complex, often invisible ways. So understanding these dynamics requires this cultural, humanistic approach that acknowledges not just the technical aspects of navigation, but also its psychological, ecological, and ethical and social costs. Even Mike Duggan's chapter adds a very important layer by examining how digital and mobile mapping technologies have transformed ethnographic practices as well. In recent years, these technologies have become key tools for engaging with human lives and stories. And Duncan highlights the way digital maps have somehow revitalized the tradition of ethnographic mapping, allowing researchers to capture not just the geographical data, not just to put, a story into a map, but really the lived experiences of individuals and communities. And also, I would say from a humanistic perspective, the digital realm opens new possibilities for critical engagement with cartography. Valentina Carraro, for instance, uses this techno-feminist lens to explore how contemporary digital mapping software continues to perform this God trick, this position of a kind of omniscient, all-encompassing objectivity. And this is a call for greater awareness of the power structures embedded in digital maps, but it's also a recognition of their potential to be transformative that we see also in both chapter. So a cultural approach to digital maps offer much more than an analysis, I would say, of geospatial data. It serves as a tool for exploring the deeper cultural, political, and ethical dimension of mapping in the digital era.
Thank you. Thank you. And moving on, then we get to the fifth section, and in that you address a whole range of questions in which critical cartographies questions which critical cartographies have tackled. I wonder if you could give us a couple of examples so we can see how you think maps can be particularly useful in addressing social questions.
Yes, sure. So our sense of critical cartographies is very expansive and multifaceted. In assembling the handbook, we sought to bring together works that illuminate the criticalities of maps from the past to the present, from being a colonialist, a masculinist, white, and abstract modes of representing space across different epochs and geographical contexts, to its transformation into this more diffractive, multi-relational, and even more powerful tool of governance. At the same time, we aimed to feature contributions that encourage us to imagine alternatives to this modern cartographic ideal, and also in its digital reproduction, highlighting the potential for cartography to become a tool for justice, recognition, transformation, focusing attention not just on the map per se, but on the use of the map, on its users, on the action geared toward maps. Andrea Paz's chapter exemplifies this approach very well by drawing on a famous passage from Joseph Conrad, Earth of Darkness. In this scene, the young Marlowe places his white finger on the blank spaces that persisted in atlases of the 19th century, symbolizing regions yet to be colonized. Andrea delves into these two cartographic documents that depict inland Africa from the 1820s and 1920s, examining how these blank spaces were racially and cartographically filled during processes of colonial appropriation. So by tracing this transformation, it not only interrogates the racialized dynamics of mapping, but also exposes the enduring legacy of these practices now in contemporary geographical imagination. This theme then of exposing, but also start to think about how to resist hegemonic cartographies is taken further by David Pereira Jr. and Björn Letto, who focus on Brazil. Their contribution highlights how indigenous peoples and Afro-diasporic communities, through their specific epistemologies, ontologies, and pedagogies, exercise the power to map in ways that safeguard their rights to existence, territory, and collective identity. So by presenting, in this case, mapping as this intergenerational, counter-hegemonic practice, their chapter underscores its potential as a tool for resisting silencing and oppression. And I would say those are all wonderful chapters, but another beautiful example enriching the scope of critical cartography is Stephen Anna's chapter that underscores the counterpowers of cartography through a focus on a 19th century hand-drawn map included in a memoir by a formerly enslaved man in North America. This map operates as an act of memory work, serving not only as a personal reclamation of the experience of enslavement and emancipation, but also as a public intervention into histories of erasure. So by centering these cartographic practices of a Black cartographer, Anna reveals how maps can function as tools of repair, challenging the erasure of race-based slavery from local official history and also landscape heritage. So together, all these examples and the others in the section illustrate, I would say, how applying this humanistic sensibility in terms of critical cartography means to involve conceptual creativity in reading various historical sources, combining subjective and collective positionalities, in using evocative images and diverse texts, cartographic and non-cartographic ones, in order to read the past, but really while always endorsing more just futures.
Thank you. And then we turn in section 6 to the one that I perhaps particularly enjoyed because of my own interest. You turn to examples where mapping has been used in eliciting and sometimes recording individual life histories as well as collective identities. As I say, I'm particularly interested in this, and I wonder why you think we need maps to record life histories and whether they offer a compelling alternative to prose accounts of individual and group life histories.
Yes, this is also a fascinating question that I think goes to the heart of how we understand the narrative potential, the narrative possibilities of maps. Humanities scholars often recognize that prose allows for a deeper exploration of emotions, intentions, nuanced reflections that maps may struggle to capture. However, I think we must not forget that life histories, whether individual or collective, are deeply intertwined with geography, where people have lived, where they've been displaced from, where significant events have occurred. So a prose account of a life story is to some extent always the telling of a map of life. Conversely, maps as visual and more than textual representations can communicate complex narratives, often with abstract signs, with minimal gestures, becoming even more effectively and immediately comprehensible than prose. So we're recounting their life stories and memories. Interviews are often instinctively turned to mapping. For example, in the first chapter, Emmanuel, a survivor of the Rwanda genocide, sketches this map of her childhood memories, becoming aware of details that were absent from her initial prose account. So this collaboration then with two geographers, with Elise and Sébastien, allowed her to create a fuller representation of her life through this co-creative mapping process. And similarly, in the second chapter, written by Piera Rossetto, we have Victor, who draws the shape of Tripoli harbor to virtually recreate his childhood environment, while Yoram traces his migration route from Tripoli using Google Maps as he recounts his experiences. So with this, I want to say that mapping is somehow intrinsic to storytelling, just as it is to movement, whether on an individual or a collective scale, as the other chapters also seeks to articulate. And beyond this, of course, the creative forms of cartographic storytelling situate and visualize these narratives spatially, can engage diverse modes of expression of visual, textual, audiovisual, symbolic, and so forth. So this section demonstrates how mapping can provide a richer depiction of life stories, offering different, I would say, more deeply resonating ways for people to represent and share their experiences. So this is why also in my chapter make the point that the maps can be understood as infrastructures of feelings, as a point of contact, as a medium capable of transforming private memories into public narratives. So they can create spaces for public intimacies where emotions became shareable and accessible to others. So while prose narratives, of course, remain vital, maps, when used creatively, when used in terms of narrative mapping, offer a compelling alternative for representing the complexities, the movements, the emotions, the cultural context embedded in personal and community histories, I would say.
Thank you. That's certainly a section that I'm going to come back to, so thank you for that. And then in the final section, you turn to maps in the public realm. That's a huge topic, and it's one that's been explored before. So I wonder if you could give us some examples of some new insights that your book gives on the topic.
Yes, well, we work in a geography section in Padua, where right under my feet, there's a brand new Museum of Geography that organizes many public events and houses a map library with 30,000 items. And recently, the Map Party project was launched, as you heard from Laura, while she was talking about the cover of the handbook. So for us, it's normal to think that humanistic research on maps has a public engagement aspect, and in general, for the humanities today, going public has become an imperative. So from a humanistic perspective, we asked ourselves in what way cartography, beyond being, of course, a technical knowledge often institutionalized, is public in other different ways. So this section works to widen further the notion of mapping for the public by including a humanistic reading of the role of maps, maps played and still play in the public sphere and the public space, in the social realm and in the information system. Being commodities, tools of emancipation, informational devices, material artifacts, and carriers of political views, maps pervade public arenas, shaping a variety of cartographic cultures. And Martin Bruckner reflects on the public life of maps from a historical and material perspective, showing how, since the beginning, printed maps emerged as social artifacts or cartifacts, transcending the goals of spatial navigation or representation. cartographic and non-cartographic uses of such artifacts intersected, as such maps variously resonated with audiences through public spaces, ritual actions, social interactions, and pedagogical contexts. In an important chapter, Tom Harper examines the history and present of public map exhibitions, with particular reference to the activities, of course, of the British Library and the different actors involved in organizing cartographic exhibitions. Barbara Breichard and Aldo de Moore's chapter instead presents a participatory mapping project undertaken in the Black Caribbean community of a London borough, which was commissioned to create a map of community support for unemployed people, and thus transformed into a very practical tool for public action. Tania shows how scientific associations like the ICA, the International Cartographic Association, finds in the arts and humanities a particularly rich terrain to cultivate public outreach. With Laura, I dig into cartographic authorship and its public dimension by collecting interviews with Laura Canali, a designer of maps for an Italian geopolitical magazine. And in the image, you can see a public exhibition of geopolitical maps. In the final chapter, we interview Bloomberg journalists Laura Bliss and Mary Patino about their famous Map Lab, a newsletter launched in 2017, which covers the world of mapping and how it intersects with the news for an audience of professionals, but also for a public of map lovers more in general. And indeed, during COVID, they gave public visibility to a campaign of self-mapping among the readers in lockdown worldwide. So the effort here in this session was to account for different meanings of cartographic publicness.
Wonderful to have a new museum opening up. That's an excellent development, very exciting. So we need to draw things to a close, but I wonder if I could ask you how you think our Tosca audiences, who are typically map scholars, practicing cartographers, map curators and librarians, students of cartography in general, how they might in particular benefit from the ideas in your book.
Yes, I think I've responded with my questions, and I think that the chapter by Tom Harper is really telling about this.
Excellent, thank you. Part of the point of your book is to alert readers to new ideas, some of which will be ephemeral, though interesting. And I wonder if you could identify one or two ideas in your book that you think will make a particularly enduring impact on 21st century cartography.
Yes, well, I think that theoretical pluralism is crucial. Since through such pluralism, we can recognize how maps are and have always been, often simultaneously rather than in oppositional ways, representations, practices, powerful devices, but also material objects, cognitive tools, embodied things, works of creativity, emplaced actions, living entities, technological machines, networks of feeling, and much more. So theoretical pluralism is fundamental to opening up also a multiplicity of research methods, from archival research to ethnographic research, from close reading to deconstruction, from thematic analysis to phenomenological and embodied observation, from non-representational methods to creative ones, and so on. And this theoretical and methodological breadth then allows us to consider a much wider repertoire of cartographic images, experiences, and practices and objects than what is normally considered in a sort of democracy of cartographic things, which thus legitimize the study of a multiform mapping universe, which is often underobserved or unobserved, but is adjunctive within our social, cultural, and spatial worlds. A second aspect we wanted to suggest is the appeal that this cartographic universe has been having in recent years. Well, in correspondence with the digital turn, a certain taste for maps has intensified, expressing itself in society in various ways. Recently, in an interview for a New York Times column, several map scholars, including me, were asked about the issue of cartographic immateriality. How, in the face of the pervasiveness of digital mapping, there is a return to cartography in material objects, like in consumer goods. And all these can be considered extremely ephemeral, of course. Yet, this is a symptom of how cartography is a multiform, malleable language incorporated into many evolving practices within digital, non-digital, and post-digital realms.
Thank you. Now, I'm conscious that the time is getting on, so we have talked about some other questions amongst the three of us, but I'm anxious that the audience get a chance to ask questions. Shall we open the floor, Nick, or shall we carry on with the questions that we had discussed before?
I think, Liz, we can open up the floor to questions. We have the extra questions which we've already discussed with Tania and Laura. So should the questions from the audience dry up, then we ought to be able to
we can just
those
swap
to the
yeah,
absolutely true, absolutely right. Thanks ever so much to the three of you for such a compelling presentation, great questions, fantastic answers, lots to chew over. What struck me, both facilitating this event and listening at the same time, was the number of the authors from your volume who are actually present in the audience tonight. And I think that says wonders for the achievement of the volume and the loyalty you've inspired from your team of authors. Absolutely marvelous. And bearing that in mind, I'd just like to voice Roger Pais. I don't know whether that's the correct pronunciation, Roger. I'm sorry if I've got that wrong. But Roger comments, I would just like to thank both Tosca organisers and Doctors Rossetto and Presti for this brilliant seminar. It has been a pleasure and honour to contribute to the Routledge Handbook on Cartographic Humanities. I think the book as a map itself, an excellent index to foster further interdisciplinary collaborations with maps and mapping at its core. So I'm guessing, would you just like to say a little bit more about how you gathered your team of authors together? And you've obviously inspired them to write some terrific stuff, and the fact they're in the audience speaks volumes. So over to you. Either of you want to answer that? No, you're not hearing.
No, sorry, I didn't get to the question. I don't know.
The question really is, how did you assemble your team of authors?
Okay.
And you've obviously inspired a great deal of loyalty and enthusiasm from this project. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Tania, you want to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. We asked the two people that were in contact with us for other research, but it was also a kind of research of names, people, more established scholars, but also young ones, emergent scholars, that would cover all the range of topics we had in mind. And as we know, compiling an edited volume with so many chapters involves a great deal of networking and seeing availability from many people. So some areas that we had in mind at the beginning, for example, queer mapping was not finally included. So it was a great work of finding the availability. And so the handbook is also the result of such limits, but also opportunities, because then we found other people and that opened up more different topics. And then with all this availability, we tried to compose the different section in a balanced manner.
Thank you. Laura, do you want to add anything, or?
No, I think that
No.
Tania already said everything. It was really a matter of including people that we knew and or which we read, of course, all the words and chapters that we wanted to have with us, and of course also then to look also for emerging scholars, you know, to give voice also to them, and we wanted it also to give a huge visibility to women. We are, as you can see, we are two female editors, and we had some the feeling that in previous handbooks and volumes on cartography, male voices were some in majority, and while there is, you know, also an increasing commitment and work made by women in this field.
Thank you. I think it's an absolutely brilliant effort, and the way you've brought everyone together, it's such a range of authors. Is there anything that you would have liked to have added to the volume which you either ran out of time for, or there just wasn't room for it?
Yes, of course. The point is that this is a book and we have like a very limited space. That's why we also asked for short chapters in order to have also more authors. And as Tania said, we really wanted some chapter reflecting on queer cartography, queer mapping, because also really a very strong field of analysis. And I think there is also a way to think more on AI mapping, for instance, but also always seen in its cultural and social implication. There are some references, for example, in Semin's chapter, but it is certain also a frontier. But you never know. We might also think on a second volume, on a second edition, the Routledge Cartographic Humanities.
Yes, I think that's, I was just going to say, volume 2 is already taking shape. So you've got a job for a long, long time out there. A question from the audience here is, thank you both for the interesting talk. To what extent do you think that the spatial turn in the humanities and the emergence of post-representational cartographic theory served as catalysts for one another, if at all?
Yes, of course, the spatial turn plays a great role because literary scholars, art scholars came in contact with cartography through the spatial turn. And what we like so much is that often literary scholars or other humanists use very freely our lexicon, cartographic lexicon, as well as geographical lexicon. They use them in not improper, but in very creative ways, that we never saw this as a limit, but as an opportunity, something that could change our ideas. And so I think that it is really, really important to have an interdisciplinary mind to accept this kind of collaboration. So the spatial turn, of course, is important. Post-representational is more difficult to explain to scholars that are external to the field, but we are trying. And of course, the processual dimension, the idea that reality is made of practices is something that is well established in other fields. So a kind of encounter can be made through this idea of the processual, the dynamic, the practical. So it's easy to put in dialogue such different traditions.
Thank you. Thank you very
Or
much.
this is our experience.
Mhm. And Laura, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I would say that there are many humanistic scholars that are practicing a poster representational reading of maps, but they don't know this, I think. They are not very much aware of this. So to us that are actually very curious about how maps and mapping practices are addressed in so many different fields, it is interesting to see a work how maps can be understood as a mapping processes, not just in the moment of their final product, but what happens all during the process of map creations and consumption. It's just that in the geographical circle, this way of thinking has been termed as a post-representational term. We have a huge debate behind this, but I think that many humanities scholars have been practicing this for a long time, let's say.
Thank you very much. Can I take this opportunity to invite members of the audience to submit questions in the Q&A? I don't want Liz and myself to be taking over the Q&A, so it'd be lovely to hear from other people. But one thing which has struck us that thinking of the History of Cartography project, which finishes in the 20th century, if you had to make any predictions about a volume covering this, the 21st century, what part do you think cartographic humanities would play?
Well, this is also fascinating questions, because I saw already that the volume that we have now, the volume 6, which is on the 20th century, was edited by Marc Momonier, who was actually one of the first to recognize the presence of a humanistic turn in cartographic research as early as in the 90s. And somehow also Dennis Cosgrove, who is a cultural geographer, one of the first who talk about the idea of cultural cartography, recognized that the 21st century was a particularly rich era, is a particularly rich era for mapping culture. So over the past 25 years, maps have become ubiquitous, as we said. There has been a significant rise in alternative voices within the field of map studies. So looking ahead, I think we envision a really humanistic, sensitive, critical, yet affirmative approach to mapping becoming central in a future volume of the history of cartographer. Although I also suspect that sometimes professional cartographers may still view humanistic approaches as little more than a curious, playful, or extravagant complement to their discipline, rather than recognizing them as a theoretical sensitivity that couldn't reach any study or mapping of practice. So as the field evolves, I think we might foresee a growing emphasis on cultural digitalities, intermedialities, but also decolonizing mapping practices. I think that a future volume on the history of cartography should, as cartographic humanities advocate, should continue to the effort to incorporate diverse senses and understandings of maps, and also historically marginalized voices that have been excluded from traditional map making, such as indigenous, feminist, post-colonial perspectives. So I don't know, perhaps in time we will see a 21st century volume on the history of cartographies rather than a singular cartography, or even a more radical history of mapping, as also Matthew Idney tried to argue in his work.
Thanks. That's a really fascinating answer. I don't know whether, Tania, you've got anything else you'd like to add to that?
Laura was exhaustive.
She was very good. What I'd like to do is go back, if I may, to I think something you said or you were talking about earlier, Tania, but you only dealt with very, very, very briefly. You mentioned music video metamaps. Could you explain more about that and tell us what that involved? Because it was the chapter you wrote, I believe.
Yes, I analyzed free music videos and I treated them as metamaps in the sense that they convey an idea, a theoretical idea of maps, and so a more descriptive idea of maps as a tool of specialization, and something more performative. And the third videos talk about a post-human take on maps, because the images of the video are about entering a map and the feeling that of being inside a map, and so what the map feels. And so I built a kind of history of map theory through 3 music videos. Watching the videos, you can somehow perform, appreciate, enter some cartographic theories. So this is the sense of the meta maps. They are not just featuring maps in the music videos, but they can help us to think about cartographic theory. So something
Incredible, yeah.
theoretical, but also fun.
Something I'll have to think about next time I see a map in a music video. Amazing stuff. Okay, we've got another question from the audience now. How can we equip ourselves as critical humanistic scholars in the face of the world in which rulers are changing maps by, for example, redrawing the borders of the United States, including Greenland, or changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico? Are we up to this challenge?
Yes, the fakeness of maps, I think, is living a kind of revival. So, as we see here, as history evolves, as politics evolves, as society evolves, we have always the need for rethinking maps anew. And so this is really old but new. I'm thinking of Momonier, How to Lie with Maps, and we are here again saying how to lie with maps and maps in a very strong manner. So maybe today we can use the concept of the fakeness, and this should be a new topic for a new work. And maybe also AI is implicated, because AI is connected also to fakeness. So I think this is, again, a frontier of map thinking, also of map activism, maybe.
Thank you very much. Anything you'd like to add, Lara?
Yes, I see this also as a very pedagogical endeavor that we have to take on. So really try to give more space to this kind of topics, to the use of cartography is not just in this technical sense, but it's mediatic use of cartography that can be done to our students in order to make them aware actually of what's happening out there. I think this is should be part of a mission of a critical humanist map scholar.
Yes, I remember that in the newsletter I cited that of the Bloomberg, when there was the case of the hurricane fake map showed. They quoted the book by Momonier, so it was interesting because in news we had cartography theorist quoted, and I noticed that it was so really. So we have something to say today to society still also about lying with maps.
Yeah, I think that's a very real and very active likelihood, given what's been going on in the last few weeks. If I may, I want to refer back. We've had Matthew Edney has contributed to this volume. You mentioned Matthew earlier, and he encourages us to focus on the process of map making. Does his approach help us understand your work in general, do you think?
Yes, I might answer this. Yeah, I think that Matthew Edney has been, first of all, an inspiring figure for our work and also for many contributors to this handbook in very many ways. And as you say, really, in his recent critique of enduring preconceptions about cartography, he rightly asserts at a certain point that nothing about mapping is fixed and stable. So this processual approach challenges, in that case, the idealized notion of cartography as this universal mode of spatial knowledge, which is instead a concept rooted in the systematic territorial surveys adopted by European states in the late 18th century, while Edney advocates, of course, for these history maps that recognize this diverse, dynamic nature of disparate mapping practices. Well, I would say that Edney's work is important because it doesn't just focus on the process of map making, but also how maps are circulating or are used in their varied context, often extending to non-cartographic forms. And in this sense, I would say that it resonates closely with the post-representational turn, the post-representational claims advanced by contemporary geographers. So in this sense, I would say that it also exemplifies what it means to be in dialogue with the humanities and the social sciences, because we think that he has been among the first historians of cartography to genuinely engage with insights from cultural geographers, from contemporary map scholars, and then to translate, discuss these perspectives into the history of cartography. So at the same time, his analysis allowed also us as contemporary map scholars to advance our understanding of cartography, maps, and mapping. So eventually, I would say that his emphasis on this kind of performative relational aspects of mapping aligns with our broader efforts to demonstrate, as Tania has already mentioned, the maps are, and they've always been plural and affected by theoretical pluralism. While in our handbook, I think that we aim to expand, of course, the scope of this endeavor to include not only process of map making, but also map reading, overwriting maps, thinking of maps as living entities, machines, networks and feelings, and much, much more. But for sure is, one of our most inspiring sources, I would say.
That's good to hear. Anything you'd like to add, Tania?
No, I think it's important, this fact that because we have this idea that the history of cartography is a great established field. So the humanities, what are the humanities in comparison to the history of cartography? That our aim was to put in dialogue such this tradition with this idea of the humanities, not to add something new or distant from it, but to include and also to respect a great tradition and specialists that work on historical cartography. So I think that Matthew Edney is a figure that is able to put in dialogue through such a processual approach that is applied both to historical maps, to the present phenomenologies of mapping.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. You've obviously, I can't remember whether you said this or not, how long this project has taken you from start to finish, but it's obviously been a very fulfilling project. What are you going to do next?
So in truth, the work was really rapid. The contributors were fantastic, very generous, and very fast. And I think that these things we perceived that these things were urgent to say. So the book came out very, very quickly. For me, a next interest could be also in methodologies. So a kind of book that works on the various methodologies, we have a very prestigious example of Julian Rowe's visual methodology. So my dream is something about all the methodologies we can use to research map, from archival research, post-representational methodologies, very different. So this could be also something useful for scholars, students. This is just a project, but we need time to develop projects.
Sounds like a lot of work. And Laura, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think that in the future, when I have time, now my idea is really to try to somehow retrace the genealogy and the scope of the critical cartography, because we know that today it's a kind of arena that is practiced also from activists, from outsiders. And so I want to put in dialogue what actually geographers are producing and what others, are doing in a kind of more conjoint, let's say, narrative. And in that, I hope to speak more about then my interest, like then on cartographies on migration, but also on feminist mapping and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to viewing the fruits of your labor in the future. I think we're probably coming to a time now where we can call a halt to proceedings this evening. There is a comment from the audience. Thank you very much for the lovely presentation. It was very interesting, but unfortunately, I have to leave early. Have a lovely evening and thank you very much. So I think that probably says it all as far as everybody here is concerned. I'd like to thank both you, Laura, you, Tania, for, excuse me, the lights are going out because nobody's moving. So, and now we have light again. So I'd like to thank you both, Tania and Laura, and for Liz as well, for putting on such a stimulating session for us tonight. I'd like to thank my colleague Stuart, who made the lights come on just then, for the technical wizardry in the background. And just to say, Tosca, we will reconvene in a fortnight's time. We mentioned at the start of the session tonight that we have Margriet and Anouk from Amsterdam coming across and giving their talk on Brazil. And all that remains for me to say now this evening is thanks again. Thank you to everyone in the audience for attending, for your questions, for your attention. And we hope to see you all soon at future Toscas. So please travel home safely if it's evening like it is here in Europe. Enjoy the rest of your day if you're the other side of the Atlantic. And we will see you all soon. Thank you very much. Good night.